Hey, YouTube family. Howdy, homies and homettes. Welcome to another edition of The Kevin Strong Show. And in this video, we're going to talk about rent control in the state of Washington, but more specifically in the greater Seattle area, how this is something that they're trying to do or they're proposing it. So please, please, please watch this video into its entirety. I am going to show a map, a national map of the United States that's showing you where certain states are closer to rent control compared to others. So rent control could be an unintended consequence. Be careful what you wish for. So without further ado, we're going to jump into this. If you are enjoying my channel and you have not subscribed, hey, do a cowboy a favor here and smash that like button, comment and share because I care. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump into this presentation here that I have set up for you. It's called Rent Control, Blessing and Curse for Tenants. So let's go ahead and jump right into this. This is some really interesting information I put together for you guys, and I'm having a little editorial that I'm going to share with you at the end. So please make sure you stay into the end of this video. So what I'm talking about on this particular slide is key discussion points, basically denser development. Basically what they're talking about is rezoning some of the areas in the greater Seattle area and throughout the state of Washington to accommodate the plight of homelessness and to address the affordability crisis that is plaguing this particular state. It's happening all over the country, but once again, this video is kind of centric to the greater Seattle area. So some of the proposals, if you haven't heard about them, is that say you have a half an acre of land and it's zoned for single family residence. Some of it might be zoned for mixed use or straight up commercial. They're talking about rezoning some of that stuff to allow some of these builders to come in and erect and build mid to high rise multi-apartment complex so they can get more people in smaller spaces. Okay, so the second half of this slide talks about Washington State. Housing demand far outpaced supply, which is what I talked about. There's legislation pending to lift rent control preemptions, is regularly introduced by state lawmakers at the behest of local lawmakers in Seattle. So there's a growing need from local constituents to reach out to their legislative body and say, hey, you've got to do something about this homelessness. You've got to do something about the lack of affordability in the greater housing, in the greater Seattle area. So this is what this is all about. Obviously, a lot of you guys know how this is set up. The governor, the state Senate control, and the state House control, all is run by Democrats. I don't have a political dog in the fight. I'm just giving you the facts. And the legislative session is from January 9th to April 23. So who knows if and when this is going to be passed. It's starting to develop more and more traction. It's probably more likely to have some form of control coming in the immediate future. So if you are a landlord, proceed with caution. But like I said at the beginning of this video, be careful what you wish for. Okay, so let's go ahead and get on to the next slide. Let's talk about the Seattle population, guys. So as I've talked about in previous videos, there was a flight to kind of get out of the greater Seattle area when the health crisis emerged in the first quarter of 2020. However, since then, it's kind of been stable for the most part. So as you can see here from 2019 up to 2020, 21, and 22, there has been somewhat of a systematic growth or increase in the Seattle population. And as that continues to basically maintain a stability standpoint from a housing standpoint and from a population standpoint, there is going to be a continued need, in my humble opinion, that the affordability crisis and the lack of housing due to the steady population in the greater Seattle area, it's not going away anytime soon. So by the numbers, let's look at what the average rent is in the greater Seattle area. I pulled this. These numbers might be 90 days off, but these are just an aggregate. I did not break it down based on 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms and studio apartments, but this kind of gives you kind of a snapshot view of what rent is on average based on neighborhoods in the greater Seattle area. Belltown, obviously 2,800, Pike Market, 2,800, Central. You guys can see this. The Seattle Central Business District is at 2,600. Westlake and Eastlake, roughly within $100 of each other. And basically Lower and North Queen and coming in roughly at the same amount. So a lot of money. We all know that this is you pay rent with disposable income after government has tax. So this is something that's chewing away at people's disposable income, to include inflation. For those of you who rent, obviously this is your most expensive monthly obligation. Okay, so let's look at how Seattle compares to other cities. So once again, these numbers are in aggregate. Seattle basically coming in at the top at 2,300, Tacoma at 1,600. And that's why I think in 2019, there was a big explosion in the the city of Tacoma population. And I said in my previous video, I think either in 2018 or in 2019, Tacoma came in as one of the hottest cities in the United States. They have cooled off since then, but once again, these cities that you can see here that have more affordability, I know I'm putting that in air quotes now, relative to Seattle, those areas will continue to see growth because people will just relocate because they're just being squeezed. Spokane, very affordable at $1,300 on average, but crime is at a torrid pace. In the Spokane area, it's rising. It's considered one of the top 10 most dangerous cities now to live in the state of Washington. And as you can see here, some of the other ones: Kent, Renton, Lakewood, and Puyallup. For those of you who are not in the greater Seattle area, Puyallup is a city that's located in Pierce County, which is probably about, 45 minutes south of Seattle, give or take a little bit. So here's an interesting stat. Seattle income is rising. Look how this income has gone up. So the estimate of median household income for King County, which encompasses Seattle, is roughly $120,000. Household income is basically considered at least two. So on average, you're looking at the average person making $60,000 a year. But as you can see down here, what I have below Seattle income rising, I also have a note that says, but home prices rose faster. So we all know that wages in the greater Seattle area, just like across the nation, have not kept up with home prices. Home prices are way out of whack. I did a video talking about that last week. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, so don't hold me to what I'm about to say here. It's something like in the Seattle area, it normally would take, let's say, 3 to 4 times your household income. And that was a good benchmark for affordability. So let me explain that, because I know that kind of sounded like gibberish a little bit. So let's say you have a household income of $120,000, as this chart indicates. So 4 times that amount, right? So you basically should be able to afford a $500,000 house based on $120,000 income, 4 times your gross. Well, that's a 4-to-1 ratio. Hopefully that clears up what I just said. But what we're at, or where we're at in Seattle, that ratio is almost over 8. It's like 8.2. So it takes 8 times the annual gross income to be able to afford a house. So affordability is just not in the cards right now. And that's why I'm one of the components that says that the housing market in the greater Seattle area has to experience a significant pull down in order for affordability to become mainstream again. So one other thing that's basically going to force a lot of people that's dealing with rent to stay a renter. Look at this chart here. This is very shocking. I've talked about this once before, but it does bear repeating. So the middle, you see that thick gray bar, vertical bar in the middle of this graph? That was basically, as you can see, 2008. During the great financial crisis. And then, as you can see, in 2010, debt shot up. Specifically, this chart deals with consumer loans, credit cards, and other revolving plans. All commercial banks basically support this type of data. So as you can see all the way over to the right of this graph, going to 2022, we're at all-time highs when it comes to consumer debt. So when you have rent at an all-time high and you have consumer debt at an all-time high, there's very little money left over for you to save up to get into home ownership. This is why some of the legislators are basically saying we need rent control, but rent control is only part of the problem. If you don't have the self-discipline to reduce your debt, if your income's not keeping up with inflation, then that's a bigger issue, in my opinion. It's not just the housing aspect of it. You've got to look at everything. And this is something that happens to affect all of us who carry debt. Not me, yours truly. I pay mine off in 30 days. But what I'm saying is that you can't legislate behavior, right? Just like you can't legislate racism. You can't legislate behavior. So you can put all the measures in place to slow down the increase of rent year over year. But at the end of the day, if you as an individual do not take responsibility for what goes into your household in relationship to what you're spending, rent control will not save you. It's only one component. So buyers are pulling back. Home buyer cancellation rates is a big deal. For those of you who don't know, KB Homes is one of the national big home builders. They are the 6th largest home builder in the United States, as you can see here in this graph. So if you look at the bottom where it says 2021, the fourth quarter, there was only a 13% home buyer cancellation. People were saying, you know what? I know I made a deposit. I know my deposit is non-refundable, but I'm just not optimistic about the housing market moving forward. So I'm just going to cancel the contract. It was at 68% last quarter. So from 2021, as you can see at the graph in the fourth quarter, to 2022 in the fourth quarter, there was a significant increase. We went from 13% to almost 70% cancellation because the consumer in aggregate is not optimistic about the housing market, and they're worried about home prices continuing to fall down. They do not want to catch a falling knife. So a lot of them have opted to just sit on the sideline and not do anything. So here's the map that I kind of promised you. Here's a map of the United States that basically talks about rent control and energy efficiency incentives by state. So the purple is basically where Washington comes in. And if you can't read this, it says preempts mandatory inclusion, zoning, and rent control, which is basically a fancy way of saying we're contemplating or thinking about rezoning and or instituting rent control. So as you can see on this map, there is a large amount of states that are in that category. The dark yellow places like New York and California, which is close to us, these are cities that already have rent control. And the ones that are kind of shaded out are basically neutral, for lack of a better term. So I'm just going to leave this up for a couple of seconds for you guys to take a look at that. But you can see where we're at. Oregon has statewide rent control. So Washington kind of follows suit a lot of times with Oregon. So once again, don't be surprised if your temperature starts to rise. I'm just saying. So let's go on to the new slide here. And this is one called steady. This is unintended consequences. So this is what I think is going to happen if and when the state of Washington or the city of Seattle decides to start rent control. You're going to have unintended consequences. So as you can see in this graph here, the guy kind of pushes the problem away and thinks it's okay. And as you can see here by the dominoes effect, it's going to, one thing leads to another, ultimately to circle back around and what? Collapse on them anyway. So what I think you're going to have is steady rent increases. If you have rent control, the landlord might require higher credit and income requirements. So here's an example that's worth chewing on. Let's say you have been in a place for a long period of time and you've got a great relationship with your landlord and they haven't really raised the rent. Okay, and then all of a sudden an unexpected expense happens, like property taxes are starting to go up dramatically, right? The tax assessor is basically a little bit behind the eight ball, so to speak. So they're catching up to some of these soaring prices and they're assessing these new property taxes, and it's really squeezing these homeowners and the landlord. So what the landlord has to do is say, hey, I need to pass some of that cost on to my tenant. But if you haven't raised rent in 2, 3, and 4 years, I know that might be hard to believe in Seattle, but for some people, their rent isn't going up crazy. Here's the example that I'm trying to make. So in this example, the landlord hasn't raised your rent. So they go, hey, John, I got to raise your rent 5% because I got hit with property taxes. You understand that, right? Okay, he does. But if you have rent control and it's capped at 3%, that landlord or that investor doesn't know when that unexpected expense is going to happen. So they have to hedge their bet for that in the future. So they're not going to allow you to stay in there without raising the rent. Because if they get an unexpected expense that exceeds the rent cap of 3%, then they are reducing their cash flow. So they are religiously going to make it a point that every time your lease is up, they're going to increase the rent up to the max. In this example, let's say 3%. So 3% might not sound like a lot, right? But what if you're in that place for another 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 years? Take out a calculator and figure out what your average rent is now and compound 3% over 10 years. You will be amazed at how much that number will grow over a 10-year period. So very, very, very interesting concept, because it could be steady income for the landlord. More importantly, from the previous graphs, you have wages not keeping up with inflation, wages not keeping up with home prices. Consumers are at an all-time debt. I had a video last week that talked about the state of Washington being the third. Was it Washington? Yeah. The state of Washington had the third most highest credit card debt on average than any other state in the country. So we're getting squeezed from inflation, from revolving debt. So my point is that how do you get out of this funk if you're dealing with inflation, your wages aren't keeping up, and you have all of this debt? You become a renter. So what I think in aggregate, what's going to happen is that I think there will be a significant pull down in the housing market in Greater Seattle. So from the peak to the bottom, I think you could easily see a 30% drop in home prices, potentially. But if that does happen, the sad thing is that from the renter standpoint, rent is not coming down 30%. Even if we only pull back 20% in housing in the Greater Seattle area, rent is not pulling back 20% because of the scarcity factor, right? Supply and demand. So just for easy math, if rent is $2,000, you think rent's going to go down $400 down to $1,600? Because that would be a 20% cut. Can you imagine rent's going down 20 and 30% in the Greater Seattle area? Because population is steady. And that's why I put up that graph. It's simple supply and demand. So even if we get a significant pullback in the housing market, don't count on the rent going down at the same time. So it's going to require you guys to be very, very creative with reducing your expenses, trying to figure out a way to get a side hustle to stay ahead of inflation and pay down your debt. You got to find somebody that's on your team, right? You got to find somebody that's really, really, really understanding this and is loyal. And the analogy I like to finally leave you guys with from a loyalty standpoint is kind of like you test somebody's loyalty like this, right? Let's say you've got a crisis that you're dealing with, and then you pull into this person's driveway and you think this person's loyal to you. Just bear with me for a minute here, right? And then this is what happens. You say, hey man, I got to do X, Y, and Z, and we got to go right now. That loyal person is not going to ask you anything. They're going to get in that car and you guys are going to go. And then you got the second person. They may be a little apprehensive when you get in the driveway. You say, hey, we got a crisis or something we got to do. They may ask a couple questions like, well, wait a minute, what's going on? But their body language, their posture is moving forward. They're still going to get in the car with you. Then you've got the other person that says, wait a minute, well, hold on, calm down. What's going on? What's the route we're going to take? Is the road going to be bumpy? Are we going to get in an accident? Now, you've got a great driving record. You've proven yourself to know what you're talking about and know where you're going. You don't have any crashes on your record, but yet and still, this person who claims to be loyal is asking you all of these questions instead of getting in the car. And then finally, you've got that last person who you thought was loyal, that when you pull into the driveway, they have no intentions of getting in the car. They ask you a couple questions and they say, I support you 100%, John. I'm going to be here for you when you get back, but I'm not getting in that car. So be careful who you ask to be your sidekick or be your passenger, because if you have a breakdown or get tired and you need somebody to take over to drive for a little bit, as that, what's that one singer's name? I can't think of her. Carrie Underwood. Jesus take the wheel. You better hope that Jesus takes the wheel, because that other person is not going to be there for you. You want that person that when you say we got something to do, they're not asking questions. They're getting in the car. They may have some questions, but they're going to Ask those questions as you're going to your destination. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to end it with my famous slogan: keep your credit score up, keep your debt down. Y'all come back now. You hear?